Dowie's rise to fame and fortune did not go unnoticed. Public opinion gradually changed from skepticism and disgust at his faith-healing practice to admiration and even amazement at his accomplishments. The press had not forgotten Dowie's long history of derogatory statements against the news media and comically named him, quote, the most remarkable of all the faith healers, prophets, or messiahs who have rushed to the rescue of a sinful world in the last half-century. Even his Elijah title increased, and reporters were quick to point it out. To the world, John Alexander Dowie was now known as Elijah the Restorer, the third reincarnation of Elijah, or Elijah the Third. Newspaper stands across the nation displayed a full front-page spread advertising Dowie as one of the greatest religious figures of their time, advertising his many alleged accomplishments, healings, but carefully balancing their stories with the hard facts. To the reader who missed those facts, however, Dowie quickly became a distinguished man of the faith. To them, the newspaper reporters were nothing more than unfaithful skeptics, as Dowie described them. At the same time, his highly publicized fortune did not go unnoticed by opportunists. To those with ambitions of building their own small empires, John Alexander Dowie became the prototype of the successful Elijah prophet. Not only was he successful through his financial and religious endeavors, he had created his own utopia. His prototype inspired a young Charles Fox Parham to study this new form of spiritualism, and Parham took a sabbatical from his own divine healing ministry in Topeka, Kansas. Parham was a supply pastor in the Methodist Church, but left the denomination in 1895, shortly after Dowie's rise to fame at his Zion establishment. Following Dowie's example, Parham disagreed with the Methodist Church hierarchy and claimed that Methodist preachers should be allowed to preach by direct inspiration by God. In 1898, Parham visited Dowie's highly publicized healing homes and returned to Topeka to create a faith-healing home he called Bethel. When news spread across the nation in 1900 that the Reverend Frank Sanford of the Holy Ghost and Us Society had raised a person from the dead, Parham took a sabbatical to see the process for himself. Arriving in Shiloh, Reverend Parham took note of the Holy Ghost and Us Society's compound structure. He spent 6 weeks at Sanford's commune and joined Sanford in a revival in Ontario. When he returned to Topeka, he modeled his own creation after Zion and Shiloh, the Bethel Bible School, and announced his own doomsday prediction. Parham began claiming that the world would end before 1925, and those willing to be saved must do so immediately. In talking with a Kansas City reporter about the trip to Shiloh, Parham praised Sanford. Interestingly, however, he avoided mentioning the more successful Elijah. Parham did not mention Dowie when he described his second trip to Chicago. He said, "I had heard a great deal of the wonderful work of Mr. Sanford and of his travels through the West to secure recruits for his Bible class in Shiloh. When he reached Kansas City, I was told of it and wished very much to meet him, but had no money. Nevertheless, I went ahead with my preparations for the trip with perfect faith that the necessary money would be forthcoming. On Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, I had just $5. But before train time, a woman handed me $20. I bought a ticket to Kansas City where, with the others of the company who were going to Shiloh, I bought a ticket to Chicago. We were $500 short of the amount we needed to pay our fare to Maine when we reached that city. Several days were spent in prayer, and one morning a telegram came with $250 and another sum was received. We went to Boston and there took a steamer for Portland, Maine. The rest of the journey was covered by rail. When I reached Shiloh, I had less than $1, but shortly afterward, $15 was wired to me, so that although I had been away from home for 3 weeks, I still had about $15. During this time, the average yearly wage in 1900 was $438 a year, and for most people, $500 would have lasted over a full year. By September 1900, Parham had started a religious utopia of his own. Purchasing an old castle named Stone's Folly with 2 towers that had been built and then abandoned, he started promoting his new ministry. Before long, Parham and a group of approximately 40 men, their women and their children, lived and worked in the school. Organizing the 2 towers of the castle as prayer towers, Parham established shifts that prayed 24 hours per day. The Parhamites, as they became known around the city, gained quick attention in January 1901 when glossolalia broke out in the compound. According to the newspaper, several cult members were suddenly able to speak in German, French, Italian, Swedish, Bulgarian, and several other languages. But their utterances had never been written down, and only Parham's sister-in-law, Miss Thistlethwaite, was able to interpret. Parham seized the opportunity and began a missionary trip to secure what the newspapers described as a long list of converts to the new faith that produced speaking in tongues. A race had begun, Dowie seeking recruits for his already thriving empire at Zion, Sanford seeking recruits for his starving commune at Shiloh, and Parham as he began to grow his members at Bethel. Newspapers compared him to the then-famous John Alexander Dowie, Cagliostro, the world-famous religious swindler from Italy, and Mary Eddy, who founded the Christian Science cult. As news of their intentions to teach divine healing spread, concern by the medical community was quickly raised. In May of 1901, city physician H.B. Hogeboom announced his intentions of turning Stone's Folly into a pest house, using its 30 rooms for hospital wards. Though it was leased by Parham's School of Tongues, the property was owned by an Eastern company, and Hogeboom thought he could gain ownership of the lease. By August, Parham had lost the lease and the compound was converted into a roadhouse. In December of that year, it was burned. Following Sanford's lead, Parham ignored the trouble in the homeland and announced that he would organize an expedition to Jerusalem. He differed with Sanford's strategy in that he claimed to know the exact location of the Ark of the Covenant by reading the Bible, but refused to tell of its hiding place. It was later learned that also like Sanford, Parham was facing legal troubles of his own. The timing of the trip that placed him out of the country was highly suspect. Parham was involved with a scam under the company name Chemical Gold, whose president was arrested under charges of obtaining money under false pretenses. It was announced that the Reverend Charles F. Parham, projector of the Apostolic Faith movement, editor of the Apostolic Faith and founder of the College of Bethel at Topeka, not an official of the company, but erstwhile confidant and advisor of its president, cannot be found. 5 stockholders and directors are clamoring for the return of their investments, or other satisfaction. George A. Francis, president of the company, posed as an alchemist and could produce, quote, gold from God by using his chemical. It was also learned that profit from this gold-making miracle was funding Parham's Bethel compound. Meanwhile, John Alexander Dowie's empire was slowly crumbling. Constantly in courts facing both civil and criminal suits from disgruntled and unhealed patients and family members of cult victims who died under his care, his negative press was flowing through newspapers across the nation faster than his printing presses could muster up miracles. His debts were quickly mounting, to the extent that some began to claim that he should try his faith cure on his debts. In March of 1902, the city of Zion suffered its first labor strike, cult victims claiming that, quote, they had to work harder than for any other boss they ever knew, and in addition, they had been expected to have their minds always focused upon the holy thoughts and glories of Elijah II. The worst of his negative publicity came when a series of health misfortunes struck Zion. In April, smallpox began to spread in one of the buildings in his compound. Though he commanded the disease to be gone, smallpox spread through the 173 Dowieites in the building, and the city of Chicago had to quarantine it for 20 days. Newspapers across the nation were eager to spread news of the obvious failure by the once famous faith healer. In May, his daughter Esther died at age 25 from burns received from curling her hair. The nation was gripped by the series of misfortunes, suddenly realizing that the healer was unable to intervene. Shortly after his daughter's death, Dowie announced his intentions to move his commune, like Sanford, to Jerusalem. Unlike Sanford, however, Dowie's financial goals were a bit higher. Dowie planned to purchase the holy city rather than plant a colony, and pressed his people to offer funds to buy Jerusalem outright. For a brief period of time, it was learned that the city of Zion was facing a financial crisis, and newspapers painted Dowie as a failure. By the end of 1903, Dowie began plans to create 2 additional Zion cities, one on the Pacific coast and one on the Atlantic. In one of the most highly publicized events of 1903, Dowie and thousands of followers marched into New York City to convert new recruits and raise investors for his multi-million-dollar projects. Newspapers from coast to coast printed almost daily articles of the modern-day Elijah's crusade, the readers eager to hear more. Dowie's name was constantly in the newspapers from February until November, and his crusade resulted in a meeting with President Roosevelt. Dowie's publicity continued for several months longer as he traveled the world seeking investors, converts, and locations to plant new Zion cities. Just before departing to Mexico in September of 1905, however, he was stricken with paralysis due to a stroke. He blamed this on his aggressive ambition, calling it the sin of overwork. By December, his condition had worsened to the extent he was forced to surrender leadership of his church. While attempting to clone Sanford and Dowie's movements, Charles Fox Parham was struggling to gain a following of his own. Upon hearing of Dowie's condition, he seized the opportunity to assume leadership. Parham left Topeka, Kansas for Zion City with intent to divide and conquer. He began holding tent meetings in Zion during the time in which he announced that he himself was the return of Elijah the prophet. According to Parham, he had received a vision from God and claimed that he was indeed Elijah III. Parham started waging a war for control in Zion as Dowie watched paralyzed, but there were many prophets seeking Dowie's robe of leadership. The Chicago press claimed that the city was suddenly overrun with prophets. Eventually, Parham gained the upper hand when he converted some Zion elders to his side. Zion's overseer, Valiva, had a special meeting urging elders to take prompt and effective measures against Parham to stop the threat. He said, "You must either choose me or this intruder who has stolen into our church. You cannot serve 2 leaders. This man is winning our most faithful people and their allegiance at a critical time. The only thing that will enable us to weather this present storm is unity. I fear this unity is threatened." In later documents from elders of Zion City, Parham was described as a depraved vulture who came to Zion a year ago looking for prey. Back home in Kansas, reporters appeared shocked that Parham had wrestled his way into an actual chance at the Zion Empire. A letter was issued to the Associated Press comparing his disruptions. This caused outrage in several counties by comparing them to the current disruption that he was facing at Zion. It read, "The Associated Press dispatch printed above will recall to the minds of old residents of Douglas County, this state, Reverend Charles F. Parham, upon whose peculiar religious teaching the Zion City outrage seems to have been based. Parham held various meetings in that county, most of them being at Eudora and others in a settlement known as Hesper. He also held revival meetings at Pleasant View, where the Holiness sect combined with Free Methodist made things very lively in every way during the summer and fall. These meetings were held in the groves, and the yelling of the fanatics could be heard a mile away. Later on, Parham went to Topeka, where he held meetings of various kinds. Nothing more was heard of him until John Alexander Dowie's troubles began at Zion City. Here one day Parham appeared and offered to become the sect's new leader. He was beaten out of the generalship by Voliva, but took a part of the original Dowieites with him and moved to the north part of the city. Here he is the leader of a band of his own belief. Eventually, Voliva gained the upper hand, and both Parham and some of his converts were excommunicated and ejected from Zion City. It was difficult to remove them all, however, because Parham had gained favor with some of the more prestigious members of Zion. Parham's more elite converts, such as Fred Francis Bosworth, the band director for Zion City, were able to remain unnoticed. Some of his secret supporters who stayed were later arrested. According to the newspapers, they were responsible for the torture and death of one Miss Letitia Greenball when they tried to cleanse her from a devil. The Parhamites at Zion had stripped off their clothes and mutilated their flesh while screaming incantations along with their unknown tongues. In the aftermath, Charles Fox Parham was not to be found. It was believed he was in hiding, but later found that he was arrested in Texas on charges of sodomy with a young boy.